Okay, let's jump right in. If you've been following global geopolitics at all, you already know the US-China relationship is constantly in flux. But we're diving into a highly strategic internal report today, and honestly, the findings in this explainer are absolutely fascinating. We are looking at a fundamental restructuring. We're talking about a shift from open, tense confrontation straight into a highly calculated transactional balance. Let's decode what this report says this means for the rest of the world. Right out of the gate, the report points out a really stark contrast. It's night and day, really. On one hand, you have Xi Jinping's severe warning. Mishandling Taiwan will lead to collision and conflict. But then, right alongside it, there's this new, publicly stated goal of moving towards constructive strategic stability. So how exactly do we get from literal threats of collision to a mutual pursuit of stability? Well, bridging that gap is basically the entire crux of this geopolitical realignment. To figure out how we get there, we're going to break down this complex, almost corporate-style geopolitical merger step by step. First, we'll look at the new strategic framework. Second, the global focus shift. Third, the actual interest trade-offs. Fourth, the hidden Taiwan Strait risks. And finally, the crises and opportunities coming out of this new world order. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the new strategic framework. The report highlights an incredibly high-level meeting at Zhongnanhai. If you're not familiar, that is the absolute center of power for the Chinese Communist Party. Beijing is essentially rolling out the red carpet, inviting Donald Trump right into the core of the state to build direct personal ties. By setting up these really intimate settings, think tea gatherings and working lunches, she's basically mirroring the exact kind of personal diplomacy he uses with Vladimir Putin. And this isn't just a photo op, right? The report suggests that by hosting US and Russian leaders back-to-back like this, Beijing is aggressively positioning itself not just as a competitor, but as an indispensable global mediator. So here's the buzzword you need to remember from the report: the constructive strategic stability relationship. Sounds formal, but what does it actually mean? It's basically a geopolitical crisis management ceiling. Both sides know perfectly well they have profound disagreements, especially on things like Taiwan and human rights. But this ceiling is put in place to keep that intense competition strictly on a manageable track. It's a mutual agreement to prevent accidental destruction, which sets the stage to start trading some very practical concessions. Moving right along the Section 2, let's talk about the global focus shift. To keep that crisis management ceiling completely intact, priorities have to change. For the incoming U.S. administration, securing stability in the Middle East is the immediate big win they desperately need. Why? Well, it's pretty simple economics. Securing ceasefires over there stabilizes global oil prices, and stabilizing oil is exactly what they need to tackle domestic inflation back home. But, diplomacy requires leverage. To secure this Middle East win, the report notes that the U.S. is purposefully cooling down the Taiwan issue just to get Beijing's strategic cooperation. It's honestly just a massive geopolitical ledger. When you stack up the U.S. priorities against China's core red lines, the trade-offs are glaringly obvious. The U.S. really prioritizes Iranian denuclearization and keeping the Strait of Hormuz open. China demands energy security. In trade, the U.S. wants Boeing sales and fentanyl crackdowns, while China is after NVIDIA chips and tariff relief. But look at the Taiwan row. For the U.S., it's currently listed as a secondary priority, a tool for leverage. But for China, it remains an absolute, uncrossable red line. Which brings us nicely to Section 3, the interest trade-offs. Let's see how this transactional diplomacy actually plays out. The underlying logic of this entire new era is practical, almost ruthless transactional diplomacy. In the Middle East, we see a perfect alignment of mutual self-interest. China agrees not to arm Iran, supporting the push to stop Iranian nuclearization. In exchange, the U.S. aligns with Beijing to prevent any tolls or over-militarization in the Strait of Hormuz. Because Beijing relies so heavily on that specific route for its own energy security, this turns into a clean, win-win transaction on the global ledger. Now, as I was reading through this assessment, one massive number immediately jumped out at me: 200. That number represents 200 Boeing aircraft. China is offering to buy these as a massive multi-billion-dollar procurement package. But make no mistake, this isn't just about upgrading their commercial airlines. It's a highly calculated trade-off. They are dangling this massive purchase to pry open U.S. restrictions. They're explicitly trying to trade these planes for the relaxation of U.S. export bans on high-end NVIDIA chips and to ease heavy fentanyl-related tariffs. It's quite literally a dollar for silicon transaction. And this transactional approach, it even extends to human rights. The report notes that the U.S. Treasury Secretary specifically brought up the Jimmy Lai case in Hong Kong. But in this new framework, this isn't purely an ideological stand. It's being explicitly tested as a human rights bargaining chip. Actually, more than that, it's a metric for Chinese trust. It's a threshold test to see if Beijing will offer up some goodwill to maintain this new constructive stability. So, with all this global horse trading going on, we have to look at Section 4, the hidden Taiwan Strait risks. The first major warning sign the report calls out is an exercise in extreme strategic ambiguity. After that high-profile Zhong-Enhai meeting, the official White House post-meeting statement completely omitted any mention of Taiwan. Just total silence. According to the assessment, this is a very deliberate blurring of lines, signaling that the issue is being intentionally downplayed to serve the broader transactional framework we've been talking about. And you have to catch this protocol shift because it is fascinating. Traditionally, announcements about Taiwan policy come straight from the Secretary of State, meaning it's viewed strictly through a security and defense lens. But the new protocol? Statements and policy hints are suddenly coming from the Treasury Secretary. It shows the issue is being yanked out of a traditional defense framework and placed firmly into a financial and trade lens. The region is essentially being recategorized as a variable in a trade negotiation, which leads to a very tangible physical shift on the ground. The report warns of a hidden shift in the quality of arms sales. The U.S. is reportedly pivoting away from providing offensive asymmetric weapons like long-range missile systems and moving strictly toward purely defensive systems. Why? Well, because offensive weapons could pierce that crisis management ceiling. This is a subtle shift, but it fundamentally changes the long-term timeline of regional deterrence. Furthermore, even the rhetoric is changing. The report notes that the U.S. administration is going out of its way to highlight the WW2 allies' relationship between the two nations. Now, historically speaking, that ally was the Republic of China, not the current ruling party in Beijing. But this historical blur is 100% intentional. It's a rhetorical tool designed to completely bypass modern ideological conflicts and just forge a pragmatic business partnership. All right, let's wrap this all up and synthesize it in Section 5, Crises and Opportunities. Let's look at the final balance sheet. The report outlines 3 distinct risks in this new era. First up, strategic marginalization. Because the U.S. is hyper-focused on the Middle East and those massive Boeing trade deals, Taiwan risks being totally crowded out of the primary international agenda. Second, deterrence degradation. That shift toward purely defensive weapons we just talked about slowly chips away at long-term military deterrence. And third, the toolization of security. There is a very real risk of becoming a bargaining chip, traded away for things like Iranian denuclearization or a better trade balance. But it's not all doom and gloom. On the flip side of the ledger, this transactional era creates some genuine opportunities. First off, it buys crucial military conflict buffer time. The mutual desire to avoid a collision guarantees a window of stability to build up internal resilience. Second, semiconductor and energy trade restructuring forces industries to adapt and carve out new, essential roles in the global supply chain, as U.S.-China trade rules get rewritten. And finally, it opens a massive door for multilateral diplomacy. With the U.S. taking this transactional approach, it's the perfect time to step up and strengthen deep alliances with Japan, Australia, and the EU. Ultimately, we are sailing straight into the unpredictable, deep waters of transactional diplomacy, and the explainer leaves us with one critical monitoring window. Will the incoming U.S. administration prioritize concrete security commitments, or will they treat the region purely as economic leverage? The answer to that question won't just define the Taiwan Strait, it is going to define the future of global geopolitics. Thanks for exploring this with me.